The imposing mansion stood with incomparable majesty in the most prestigious region of the city, being the perfect reflection of Matthew Sinclair's victory and status. Through one of its large windows, he observed the surrounding scenery with a feeling of satisfaction mixed with a certain melancholy. He remembered the countless sleepless nights and the challenges he had to overcome to reach that point of success. Rich, influential, and admired, he was the portrait of a determined man whose life seemed to have shaped itself according to his most ambitious desires. By his side, Victoria, always elegant and impeccable, shared that moment with him, albeit silently. However, there was something mysterious in her gaze, a peculiar glow that suggested her mind was far away, reflecting on something she would never dare to confess. Matthew, immersed in his satisfaction with his achievements, did not notice anything different about his wife. He, completely absorbed in his own contentment, could not imagine the thoughts that passed through his mind. "Is this paradise?" she asked, her voice sweet and soft, like an enveloping melody almost unreal. Matthew smiled warmly, placing a soft kiss on her lips, before responding with calm confidence. "Yes, Victoria, everything I've ever dreamed of. And best of all, it's only just beginning." He had achieved his fortune through a lot of effort and sacrifice, putting aside moments of rest, personal relationships, and even emotional ties. Victoria, although she admired his tenacity, began to feel a growing distance between them, a void that she didn't know how to fill. "Tonight, we're going out to dinner. I made a reservation at your favorite restaurant," Matthew announced enthusiastically, trying to show how much he cared. "You deserve the best, Victoria." She smiled slightly, but something in her look, almost imperceptible, revealed a trace of contempt that went unnoticed by him. Matthew, absorbed in the demands of his work and with his cell phone constantly in hand, did not notice the subtle coldness in his wife. For him, Victoria was the perfect woman, beautiful, sophisticated, and always by his side at all times. However, what he ignored were the feelings of anguish and the shadows that hung over her. "All this, Victoria, is for us," he said, watching her fondly as she adjusted a pearl necklace in front of the mirror, "to ensure you have the best life possible with complete safety." She replied with disguised softness, her voice almost neutral. "I know, Matthew. I really am very lucky." While Matthew believed he was providing everything she needed, living under the illusion that her life was completely stable, Victoria hid dark plans that were being hatched in secret. In partnership with Charles, Matthew's younger brother, she was up to something dangerous. That night she told him she was going to go to the movies, but her destination was different. She drove to an isolated parking lot, far from the mansion, where Charles was waiting for her. He was leaning against a post with a serious face and a calculating look. "Is everything in order?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Yes," Victoria replied, checking their surroundings carefully to make sure no one saw them. The next morning, Matthew had an important meeting, and everything was being orchestrated to make it look like an accident. Charles, with a cold smile on his face, said, "I have already damaged the car's steering system. There will be no suspicion. It will seem like something completely unexpected." Victoria nodded, satisfied with the plan that was being drawn up. However, what neither of them knew was that, in that empty parking lot, there was an unexpected witness. Trevon, a street kid, was there taking shelter from the cold of the night. He hid behind a vehicle, and without Victoria and Charles knowing, he heard the entire conversation, every word of the conspiracy. What seemed like a flawless plan began to spiral out of control, as a secret, no matter how well kept, rarely stayed hidden forever. That chance meeting could be the key to turning around the entire game that was about to be played, without anyone imagining the consequences that would arise. Trevon, with his own goals and challenges, now had the power to change the course of that story, in a way that neither Victoria nor Charles could predict. Trevon, despite his youth, possessed an age-defying perception he carried. His sharp mind and sharp instincts made him older than he looked. When the truth of what was about to happen finally dawned on him, something inside him broke. "I couldn't ignore what I knew. When Victoria and Charles, confident that their plan was perfect, walked away, the boy didn't hesitate. A whirlwind of feelings dominated him, a mix of fear and fierce determination. He knew he couldn't allow Matthew to be caught in such a treacherous trap. Something inside him pushed him to follow them both, no matter the risks. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the adrenaline made him feel like the world was in slow motion. Anxiety took over every step, but he knew he couldn't fail. His eyes, attentive to Victoria's every movement, followed the two from a distance, always careful not to be noticed. The city around him began to change. The common and simple streets gave way to wider and more well-kept avenues, where imposing buildings and mansions reflected the ostentation of an upper class that seemed so far from their reality. It was then that he saw it. A mansion of grandiose proportions rose before their eyes, surrounded by majestic trees and with an almost oppressive air of isolation. The view was breathtaking, but for a moment the boy found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of the place. However, the urgency of the mission quickly roused him from his state of awe. He didn't have time to lose himself in wonder. Matthew's life was at risk, and he could not allow Victoria and Charles's plan to come to fruition. Victoria entered the property with a firm step, as if this were a place where she had complete control. Trevon's heart sped up even more. He hid among the shadows of the trees, his body motionless as he observed the scenery. The house, which once seemed to be a symbol of success and wealth, now seemed a haven of danger, a place where intentions were as dark as the shadows that enveloped it. The boy felt a mixture of dread and resolution, every cell in his body alerting him to the need to act. He couldn't just stand there and watch. Matthew needed to know about the betrayal. "I need to tell him. He has to know what's going on," Trevon murmured, barely sounding out. Her words were filled with a weight he could barely understand, but doubt invaded him. How could he convince someone so powerful, someone so far from his reality, that his life was in danger? How could a boy like him, with no influence or power, make a difference? Breathing heavily, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering all the courage he possessed. He wasn't a man, but he wasn't a child either. I knew that in action, the fear of being ignored or even rejected could be fatal. The doubt still persisted, but his determination spoke louder. He needed to do this. The next day, just before dawn, Trevon was back. The cold dawn cut into his skin, but he barely felt it. Time seemed to stand still as he stood on the side of the road, watching what was approaching. His heart was tight and anxiety was making him sick, but he knew there was no other option. Matthew needed to be warned. Then, finally, the sound of a car cut through the morning silence. Trevon, without thinking, threw himself towards the vehicle. His arms flailed frantically, and the car came to a screeching halt. The window opened, revealing Matthew's face, surprised, but with an expression that quickly turned to irritation. "What are you doing here, boy?" Matthew's voice sounded harsh, full of disdain. Trevon, without hesitation, spoke urgently. "Sir, it's urgent. Your life is in danger." Matthew watched him for a moment, his eyes assessing the boy with an intensity that made Trevon feel like he was being stripped naked. He looked skeptical, suspicious, but there was something in the boy's eyes that made him hesitate, even if just for a second. He could see the sincerity in Trevon's eyes, something he didn't see every day. "Speak quickly," he said, crossing his arms as he waited. Trevon took a deep breath, feeling the tension build in his chest. He knew that what he was about to reveal would change everything, but the urgency of his mission compelled him to speak, even with his heart racing. With the words tumbling out of his mouth almost uncontrollably, he quickly said, "I heard your wife and your brother last night. They are planning to damage your car's steering system so that you lose control and have an accident. All this to keep your fortune." Matthew paused for a moment in disbelief, and his face hardened. He let out a dry laugh, as if he thought it couldn't be real, it couldn't be possible. His mind, still stunned by the revelation, tried to process what he had just heard. "Victoria and Charles? That's absurd," Matthew replied, his voice full of disbelief. He looked at Trevon with a mix of confusion and disdain. "Are you saying that they planned this? This is crazy." But Trevon didn't back down. He looked directly into Matthew's eyes without hesitation, and spoke with such intense sincerity that even Matthew couldn't ignore it. "I know it's hard to believe, sir, but please check your car's steering system. I'm not lying." Disbelief still hung in the air, but something in Trevon's desperate tone, something in the urgency of his words, made Matthew pause. He couldn't ignore the sincerity in the boy's eyes, and doubt began to creep into his mind. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't imagine it would be so serious. After a brief silence, Matthew finally gave in, the tension in his body visible. "Okay," he said in a strained voice. "Wait here. I'll call the mechanic." As Matthew walked away, Trevon stood still, feeling the weight of the moment. Every second felt like an eternity, and the tension in the air was palpable. He knew he had done the right thing, but anxiety still consumed him. What would be going on in Matthew's mind? Would he believe the boy? The mechanic arrived quickly, and his face was serious, his expression serious. He didn't need to say anything else. His eyes said it all. "Sir, the steering system has been sabotaged. If I had driven that car, I would have lost control and probably would not have survived." Matthew was speechless, shock taking over him. Anger, sadness, and disbelief mixed together in an emotional explosion that almost made him lose his balance. The pain of knowing that Victoria and Charles, the two people he trusted most, had plotted his death to steal his fortune, was unbearable. He looked at Trevon, the gratitude in his gaze being mixed with deep pain. You saved my life, boy. But tell me, why did you risk so much to tell me this?" Trevon lowered his head, but his voice didn't waver. He spoke with an immense sincerity, which seemed to weigh more than any gold or wealth, because it was the right thing to do. "No matter where I come from, I knew I couldn't let that happen. Now let us act together," said Matthew, his voice deep and decisive, conveying an implacable confidence. "I'll make sure you never have to worry about that again." He paused and stared at Trevon, conveying an intensity the boy couldn't ignore. "And in return, you will be my eyes and ears. I'll need your help with what's to come." Trevon felt the weight of Matthew's words, a sense of responsibility washing over him. The trust Matthew placed in him made him feel more prepared for what was to come. "You can count on me, sir," he replied with a firm voice, determined to help in the best way possible. Matthew knew the battle would not be easy. A simple change of will would not be enough to defeat Victoria and Charles. They were much more involved than they seemed, and Matthew would need a much more complex plan to ensure his victory. "Besides," Matthew continued, his gaze steady and calculating, "we need to create an illusion. Let's stage an accident. They need to believe that their plan was successful." He looked at Trevon, hoping the boy understood what was at stake. "We need to make them believe I'm dead." Trevon, still surprised by the audacity of the plan, slowly smiled as he realized the reasoning behind it. "So you're going to fake your death, and they're going to think they got what they wanted, right?" he asked, eyes shining with understanding. Matthew nodded, pleased with how quickly Trevon had understood what was happening. "Exactly. They need to be completely convinced that they have won. Only then can we take them down once and for all." With the plan now clear, the two began preparing. Night fell, and the operation went into effect. They had chosen a remote, deserted road where they could destroy Matthew's car without being seen. The incendiary device was carefully installed in the vehicle, and with every detail, Matthew and Trevon took every necessary precaution to ensure the plan was perfect. Before they left, Matthew said goodbye to Victoria with a hidden smile, trying to hide the anxiety that consumed him. "Take care of yourself, my dear," he said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Rest well." Victoria, her eyes shining with impatience, responded with a forced smile, not realizing what was about to happen. She believed she was about to achieve everything she wanted, and nothing would make her doubt that. Arriving at the prepared location, Matthew and Trevon placed the incendiary device in the car. When they were a safe distance away, Matthew activated the mechanism. The car was consumed by flames within seconds, the fire taking over everything around. It was an impressive sight, and they both knew that the next day the news would spread quickly. Matthew had died in a tragic car accident. Victoria, upon hearing the news, couldn't hide the satisfaction in her eyes. She turned to Charles, who could barely contain his excitement. "He's really gone," she said with an almost triumphant smile. Charles, barely able to hide his excitement, replied, "Now we are waiting for the inheritance. What we always wanted is finally within our reach." Meanwhile, Trevon watched from afar, paying attention to their every move. He wrote down everything he saw and passed the information to Matthew, who remained hidden in a safe place, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow. "They really believe you're dead," Trevon said, his voice full of satisfaction. "Charles is already talking about the money." Matthew, wherever he was, felt a surge of triumph. The plan was working exactly as they had planned. The trap was about to be closed. A few days later, Victoria and Charles went to Matthew's law office to discuss the details of the inheritance. They were confident, with the feeling that nothing could stop them anymore. On the way to the office, Victoria and Charles exchanged disguised smiles, like accomplices in a plan that they believed was infallible. "Make sure everything is in order before we sign any documents," the lawyer said with a serious expression as he adjusted his glasses. Victoria nodded, but the restlessness in her gestures betrayed her rush to complete the process. While reviewing the papers, the lawyer paused, frowning when he came across an unexpected detail. "There is an additional clause that deserves attention," he announced, drawing tense looks from Victoria and Charles. He cleared his throat and continued, "Inheritance is conditional on death from natural causes. In any other scenario, the wife loses the right to the assets." The news hit Victoria like a blow. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought, while Charles looked away, trying to hide his surprise. The air in the room became heavy, and the silence was broken only by the sound of pages being turned by the lawyer. From where he was, Matthew watched everything carefully. Hiding in the shadows, he waited for the right moment to unmask the two. The plan he had devised was beginning to take effect, and he knew that their despair was just the beginning. "This is a mistake," Victoria exclaimed, regaining her voice. "Matthew would never have included something like that without consulting me." Her voice wavered between disbelief and anger as she looked to the lawyer for an explanation. Charles, at her side, remained silent, but his expression betrayed his growing concern. "There is no mistake," replied the lawyer, without changing his calm tone. "This clause was added shortly before the accident. It is an official and recorded decision." He held the documents tightly, as if prepared for any reaction. Victoria crossed her arms, trying to contain the anger that threatened to boil over. "That's ridiculous. Why would he do something like that?" The question seemed more directed at herself than at others in the room. Charles, still avoiding her gaze, ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe he had his reasons," the lawyer suggested, his voice impassive. He showed no interest in debating, limiting himself to pointing out the facts. Victoria, however, was not willing to accept it so easily. "Matthew wouldn't do that. There has to be a way to object," she insisted, her voice taking on a higher tone. Charles finally tried to intervene. "Calm down, Victoria," he said, though his words sounded hollow. "Maybe we can resolve this another way." The lawyer, with a sharp gaze, fixed his eyes on the two. "The clause is clear and unquestionable. Any attempt to circumvent it will be seen as a violation of the established conditions." Her unshakable stance increased the tension in the environment, and Victoria began to lose control. She slammed her hand on the table, her patience reaching its limit. "That's absurd. I can't believe Matthew would do something like that." His voice echoed through the room, filled with frustration and indignation. Charles, speechless, simply watched her, unable to offer any support. The lawyer, however, was unfazed. His cold gaze remained fixed on her, as if he had already expected this type of reaction. Before anyone could react, the door was decisively opened. Matthew appeared, accompanied by Trevon, who maintained a calm, almost enigmatic expression. The silence in the room was broken by his presence, and the air seemed to grow heavier. "Surprised to see me?" Matthew questioned, his voice low but filled with a controlled anger that seemed to pulse through every word. Victoria and Charles stood frozen, their gazes fixed on him as if they were facing a ghost. Surprise and fear mixed in their expressions, and for a moment no one seemed able to say a single word. Trevon remained at Matthew's side, watching the scene with an almost imperceptible smile. Matthew took a few steps forward, his sharp eyes switching between Victoria and Charles. "I know everything," he stated, each word sounding like a hammer slamming against their resistance. "I know about the plan, I know about your meeting in the parking lot, and I know exactly how eager you were to get rid of me and get your hands on my money." Victoria tried to compose herself, but it was clear that the mask of control was about to collapse. Charles looked away, unable to look at Matthew. The atmosphere seemed electrified with growing tension. "Did you guys really think I wouldn't find out? That you could just erase me from the equation without me noticing?" Matthew continued, his voice now more cutting, filled with a mixture of pain and indignation. Victoria finally found the strength to speak, although her voice was shaky. "Matthew, this is a huge misunderstanding. You're not looking at the situation from the right angle." He raised an eyebrow, sarcasm evident in his expression. "A misunderstanding? So please, Victoria, explain it to me. Convince me that what I heard and saw is not real." Charles, who until then had remained silent, tried to intervene. "Matthew, you need to understand. It wasn't my idea. Victoria convinced me that—" "Stop!" Matthew interrupted him, his voice rising in intensity. "Don't you dare put all the blame on her. You had a choice, Charles. You could have said no, but you chose betrayal." Charles lowered his head, unable to refute. Victoria, on the other hand, began to show signs of anger, frustration growing in her eyes. "You don't understand, Matthew," she began, her voice getting louder. "You were always so focused on work, on your business, that you forgot about us. You never realized what was right in front of you." Matthew took a step closer, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on her. "I didn't realize why I trusted you. I believed we had something solid, something worthwhile, and you threw it away out of greed." Victoria tried to retort, but Matthew raised his hand, silencing her. "Enough. There is no justification that can erase what you did." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with an overwhelming silence, as Matthew seemed to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Finally, Victoria, unable to contain the pressure, exploded. "Yes, it is true," she shouted, anger boiling over in her words. "I was tired of living in the shadows. You never paid attention to me, Matthew. You were always more involved in your business than in us. I couldn't take it anymore." Matthew looked at Victoria with an expression full of disgust, his anger mixed with a deep sadness that seemed to dominate his being. "You made the wrong choice, Victoria. Did you think that, by destroying everything around us, you would be able to achieve what you wanted so much?" His voice was tense, but his gaze was heavy, reflecting the suffering he felt. Before she could defend herself or offer an explanation, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Matthew's lawyer, until then silent, made a discreet gesture, signaling that something was about to happen. It was then that the two policemen entered, and Victoria and Charles's hearts raced, as if they had been hit by an unexpected blow. "Matthew, you can't do this!" Victoria screamed, her voice breaking, overcome by the panic that was now raging in her mind. "I loved you, Victoria. I did everything I did because I believed in both of us, in our future together," Matthew replied, his voice thick with pain. But even in the midst of this anguish, he could not hide his frustration. What she had done could not be justified. "No, Victoria," Matthew spoke again, his voice now cold, without the slightest mercy. "You didn't do this for us. She did it for herself. Your greed is what motivated you." The police officers, with serious faces, advanced towards Victoria and Charles, and the weight of reality fell on both of them. The shock of being arrested, of seeing everything he had built crumble, was crushing. Matthew's expression, once marked by pain, now remained intransigent, but his heart still beat with a deep sadness. He watched them one last time, his eyes expressing silent regret. However, as he looked at their faces, filled with guilt and regret, he felt no compassion. He felt only anger and shame as they handcuffed them. He remained there, immune to the scene before him. His face, hard and expressionless, hid the pain that still consumed him inside. The weight of everything that had happened hadn't disappeared, but there was something there that made him feel like that moment was necessary, no matter how painful it was. When Victoria and Charles were taken away, their words of innocence were lost in the air, without an echo, without credibility. The feeling that this would bring no satisfaction was clear to Matthew. What was left was just a cold emptiness and the feeling that justice was being done, but without any trace of pleasure. Trevon, beside Matthew, watched with a calm that contrasted with the tension of the situation. There was a slight satisfaction in his eyes, something he didn't make a point of hiding. The truth had prevailed, and Matthew, with Trevon's help, could now envision a future free from the manipulations and betrayals that had marked his life. As the tension began to dissipate, Matthew placed his hand on Trevon's shoulder in a silent gesture of gratitude. "If it weren't for you, my friend, I would never be here to see this day," he said, the sincerity in his voice clear, a deep appreciation for everything Trevon had done. Trevon, always restrained and discreet, just nodded, but there was something more between them, something words couldn't capture. A strong bond, forged through adversity, more solid than any obstacle they had faced. Their friendship had become an unbreakable alliance, a beacon of loyalty in the darkness. After the officers left, Matthew headed to his office. He sat in the chair, watching the window with a distant gaze. The emotions of the day began to calm down, but there was a scar that still remained, a deep wound that wouldn't close so easily. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The betrayal had changed his essence, transforming him. It made him more vigilant, more careful, and more aware of the fragility of trust. He learned in the most painful way to value what he previously took for granted. He knew his life would never be the same. The betrayal had transformed him, making him more cautious, and above all, teaching him to value trust, a rare and precious asset. Beside Matthew, Trevon seemed distant, his eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in his own thoughts. There was something in her expression that revealed the depth of her emotions, something he still couldn't fully process. Matthew watched him with a look that mixed affection and admiration, as if he recognized something special in this young man. He made a soft gesture, inviting him to come closer and sit next to him, something that seemed so simple but carried an immense weight of meaning. "You gave me something that no other human being was able to offer me," Matthew began, his voice thick with emotion. "Your loyalty was the key to saving me, and I will never forget what you did for me." Trevon, a little disconcerted, looked away, trying to hide the feeling of heat spreading through his body. It was hard to believe that someone like Matthew, who always seemed so strong and unflappable, was speaking like that. "I only did what I thought was right," he murmured, with a shyness that rarely manifested itself in his personality. Matthew smiled, and that smile was more than an expression of gratitude. It was a genuine smile, a reflection of the deep connection that was being formed between them. He looked at Trevon with silent understanding, as if he knew this moment marked the beginning of something new and transformative. He saw in Trevon not just a friend, but someone with immense potential, a light that could not be ignored. Something great was unfolding before him. With this new realization, Matthew made a decision that would change Trevon's life irreversibly. "I want you to be part of my family, Trevon," he said, his voice firm but filled with an unusual gentleness. "I will care for you as if you were my own child, and I will help you build the future you deserve." Trevon was speechless, stunned by the unexpected offer. He had never imagined that someone like Matthew, with all his power and resources, would look at him with such respect. What seemed like a distant dream now became reality before his eyes. A feeling of hope blossomed in his chest, a hope he had never known could exist. Over the next few days, Matthew devoted himself to revising his will, making adjustments that reflected his changing outlook on the future. He wanted to ensure that in addition to his fortune, Trevon received the most important thing, the responsibility of a legacy. For Matthew, it wasn't just about passing on his riches, but about ensuring that Trevon was prepared to take the lead in all that he had built. He wanted more than a successor. I wanted someone capable of guiding with wisdom, someone who understood the weight of trust and integrity. "You will learn everything I know," Matthew told Trevon as he handed over the legal documents. "And when the time comes, you will be ready to carry this legacy with pride." What followed was a period of intense learning for Trevon. He immersed himself in the business world, absorbing everything Matthew taught him. But the lessons were not limited to the corporate environment. Matthew also guided him on issues of character and values. He told him about the importance of respect, honesty, and responsibility, values that were the foundations on which any dignified life should be built. "If you build your life with these principles, it will be a man who will make a difference in the world," Matthew said firmly. For Trevon, those words became more than advice. They became a moral compass, a guide to life. Growing up without a family to support him, Trevon finally found in Matthew not just a mentor, but a father, someone who would help him become the best version of himself. Over time, the bond between Matthew and Trevon strengthened. What began as a mentor and apprentice relationship has become something much deeper. They became a real family, not only because of blood ties, but for the mutual choice of being together, of taking care of each other. For Matthew, Trevon represented the renewal of something he found lost, the purpose. He was no longer just as a businessman or a successful entrepreneur. Through Trevon, he found a reason to move on, a motivation that transcended material issues. For Trevon, life alongside Matthew was all he always dreamed of. He found more than a home. He found a place where he could finally be himself, where he could grow and become someone better. The mansion, which once seemed empty and cold, was now full of life. Laughter, conversations, and shared dreams filled the corridors, and the loneliness that once haunted him dissipated, giving way to a vibrant, hopeful energy. Together, Matthew and Trevon started writing a new story, a story that was theirs and no one else. A story of trust, loyalty, and a deep understanding of what it means to be a true family. They showed the world that the true family is not just in the blood ties, but in the choices we make, the people we decide to embrace, and the ones who choose to be by our side at the most difficult times. If you like this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here you will find exciting stories every day made to touch the heart, and I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will thrill you too. Don't miss it.